stories about the urban legend of the basement clown. You hear the faint squeak of a balloon. It's distant, almost like a memory, but the sound grows louder. You freeze. Something shifts behind you. The air grows cold, and then, there it is. A raspy voice, soft but giddy. "I've been waiting for you all these years." You spin around, but there's nothing there, only shadows. And then, from the darkness of the basement, the laughter starts. It was supposed to be just another harmless dare, the kind teenagers toss around on a boring Friday night to spice things up. But this wasn't like sneaking into a cemetery or playing with a Ouija board. No, the clown of the basement was different. Every kid in Greensboro knew the story, passed down like a cursed heirloom, a dark piece of local folklore that felt too specific, too vivid to be made up. Parents warned their children to stay away from the old Maxwell house, now a sagging ruin at the edge of town. The windows were shattered, the paint long since peeled away, leaving only a skeleton of what had once been a happy home. But the most disturbing part wasn't the way the house looked, it was the way it felt. Cold, even in the summer, silent, even when the wind howled. The kind of silence that pressed against your eardrums until you swore you could hear it breathing. Mia had heard the stories 100 times before, told in whispers during sleepovers or around campfires. They all started the same way, with a birthday party in 1972. The Maxwells had hired a clown for their son's 8th birthday, a man who went by the name Smiley. The kids loved him at first. His squeaky shoes, his balloon animals, the way he juggled with a manic energy that left them in stitches. But as the afternoon wore on, something shifted. Smiley's laughter grew louder, harsher, until it no longer sounded like laughter at all, but a jagged, rasping noise that grated against the ears. Some of the children said his smile didn't match his eyes, that his painted grin seemed to stretch wider and wider, as though his skin might split apart. And then, when the parents stepped away to prepare the cake, it happened. Smiley led the children, one by one, into the basement, saying he had a special surprise waiting for them. The screams started moments later. By the time the parents broke down the locked basement door, it was too late. The room was drenched in blood. Tiny chairs, now infamous in every retelling of the story, were arranged in a grotesque circle, each one tied to a balloon. The children were there too, or rather, what was left of them. Their small, mangled bodies looked more like broken dolls than human beings. Smiley was never found, but the basement carried his presence, a lingering malevolence that seemed to seep into the walls themselves. Over the decades, countless people claimed to hear laughter coming from below, or the faint sound of balloons squeaking in the dead of night. And every so often, someone went missing near the house, usually a kid, lured in by the thrill of the legend. For Mia, it wasn't about belief. She didn't buy into ghost stories. Sure, the Maxwell house was creepy, but she figured the rest was just exaggerated nonsense, a way to keep kids away from a dangerous old property. When her friends dared her to go inside, she didn't hesitate. They were all huddled in the overgrown yard, flashlights darting nervously over the warped planks of the porch and the jagged shards of glass still clinging to the window frames. 10 minutes, she said, smirking as she pocketed her phone. "And then you owe me pizza." Her bravado cracked just slightly as she pushed open the rotted door. It groaned loudly, as though protesting her intrusion, and a musty wave of air hit her like a slap to the face. She wrinkled her nose but stepped inside, her sneakers crunching on debris that littered the floor, splinters, broken bottles, and something that looked suspiciously like dried blood. The house was dark, the kind of dark that swallowed her phone's weak flashlight almost entirely. Shadows loomed in the corners, stretching and shifting as if alive. The silence was unnerving, thick and oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath her feet. She tried to shake off the growing unease, telling herself it was just an old house, nothing more. But then she saw the basement door. It was smaller than she'd expected, tucked away at the back of the kitchen like an afterthought. The door itself was warped, the paint flaking off in patches to reveal raw wood beneath. A rusted padlock hung loosely from the latch, broken clean in half, as though someone, or something, had forced their way in. Mia hesitated, her hand hovering over the knob. She glanced back toward the front door, where her friends were waiting outside, laughing nervously and probably checking their phones. Part of her wanted to turn back, to tell them the dare wasn't worth it. But the other part, the part that hated looking weak, told her to push forward. She wasn't about to be the girl who chickened out over some stupid urban legend. The moment she opened the basement door, the smell hit her. It was like walking into a tomb. The air was thick with the stench of rot, a cloying, sickly sweet odor that clawed its way down her throat and made her gag. She shone her flashlight down the stairs, but the beam barely penetrated the gloom. All she could see were the first few steps, coated in dust and something dark that might have been mold or dried blood. A faint noise reached her ears, so faint she almost thought she was imagining it. It was a low hum, like the sound of a balloon being stretched, followed by the softest of pops. Her pulse quickened. She told herself it was just her nerves, that old houses made noises all the time. But the sound came again, louder this time, accompanied by a faint, lilting giggle. It wasn't funny. The laughter was light, almost childlike, but there was something off about it, something that sent a shiver crawling up her spine. She swallowed hard, gripping her phone like a lifeline as she descended the stairs, each creak of the wood beneath her feet feeling like a scream in the silence. As she reached the bottom, her flashlight flickered, and for the first time, she felt the distinct, unshakable sensation that she wasn't alone. Mia stood there, frozen, as the giggle rose again, louder now, and unmistakably close. The smell was the first thing that hit her, sharp and revolting, a pungent cocktail of decay and mildew that clung to the air like an invisible fog. It was thick, oppressive, almost alive, pushing against her nostrils, invading her lungs with every shallow breath. Mia pressed a hand over her mouth and nose, her stomach churning as the stench grew stronger with each hesitant step she took down the stairs. The flashlight beam from her phone trembled, its weak light barely cutting through the heavy darkness that seemed to gather at the edges of her vision. It wasn't just the absence of light that unnerved her. It was the sensation of being watched, as though the shadows themselves were leaning in, wrapping around her, pulling her deeper into the suffocating blackness. The basement stairs creaked ominously beneath her weight, each groan of the old wood amplified by the silence that pressed down like a physical force. It wasn't the kind of silence she'd expected. It wasn't empty. It had a texture, an unsettling fullness, like the space itself was pregnant with sound waiting to be born. Her ears strained, trying to pick up any noise, any hint of movement. And then she heard it again, the soft pop of a balloon. It wasn't sharp, like a balloon breaking. It was softer, slower, as if something or someone was deliberately letting the air out. Mia froze mid-step, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her mind raced to find a rational explanation, but none came. She told herself it was just an old pipe, or maybe the house settling. But deep down, a knot of dread tightened in her chest, pulling her toward a darker truth. It didn't help that the air seemed to grow colder with every second she lingered on the staircase. The temperature dropped in a way that felt unnatural, like stepping into a walk-in freezer, the chill cutting through her hoodie and biting at her skin. She shivered, clutching her phone tighter, the flimsy light barely illuminating the bottom of the stairs. The basement itself was worse than she'd imagined. It wasn't just dark, it was wrong. The walls were cracked and damp, streaked with what looked like black mold creeping up from the floor like veins. The air was heavy, thick with moisture, making it feel like every breath she took was laced with something toxic. The faint glow of her flashlight revealed discarded furniture scattered across the room. An overturned chair here, a rotting table there. But the most unsettling detail was the balloons. They were everywhere. They hung limply from the ceiling, their colors faded to sickly pastels, their surfaces wrinkled like old skin. A few still floated, bobbing eerily in the stagnant air, their strings trailing toward the floor like they were tethered to invisible hands. But most were deflated, sagging into puddles of rubber that dotted the ground. She felt her stomach twist at the sight of one in particular, a red balloon tied to the back of a small chair. The chair itself was child-sized, its paint chipped and peeling, and the balloon string looped tightly around the armrest. For a moment, Mia could almost hear the faint echoes of children's laughter, distorted and distant, like a recording played underwater. She moved closer, drawn to the chair despite every instinct screaming at her to turn back. Her fingers brushed the string of the balloon, and it felt wrong. Not like rubber. Something else. Something slick and clammy, like the flesh of a creature that had been dead for far too long. She recoiled, her heart pounding as she stepped back, only to bump into something behind her. Mia spun around, her flashlight darting through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just the empty basement, the shadows twisting and shifting as though mocking her. She swallowed hard, her throat dry and tight, and forced herself to take another step forward. She didn't want to admit it, but she was starting to feel it. The pull. The same magnetic force that seemed to drag every person who had ever dared to enter this basement deeper into its clutches. Then she heard it. A whisper. It was faint at first, like the rustling of dry leaves, but it grew louder, clearer. The voice was soft, childlike, but with an undercurrent of something far more sinister. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, the words stretching out like they were being pulled from a smile too wide, too sharp. Mia's stomach churned, the bile rising in her throat as the voice echoed around her, bouncing off the walls in a way that made it impossible to tell where it was coming from. "Who's there?" she managed to choke out, her voice trembling. But there was no answer. Only a low giggle, high-pitched and breathy, the sound of someone trying to stifle their laughter but failing. It sent a wave of goosebumps rippling across her skin, her fingers tightening around her phone as if it were her only lifeline. The giggle grew louder, bubbling up from the corners of the room, until it sounded like it was coming from everywhere at once. Mia backed away, her footsteps crunching on the debris-strewn floor. But the laughter followed her, closer now, pressing against her ears like a physical weight. Her flashlight flickered, the light sputtering as if the darkness itself were trying to snuff it out. And then, for just a moment, the light caught something. It was only a glimpse, a fleeting flash in the corner of her vision, but it was enough. A face, pale and round, with eyes like black marbles that seemed to glisten in the dark. A painted grin stretched across its features, the red paint smudged and cracked, revealing a jagged line of teeth underneath. The face was there, and then it wasn't. Mia's breath hitched, her chest heaving as she tried to convince herself she hadn't seen it. But she couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, lurking just beyond the edge of the light, watching her. The whisper came again, softer this time, almost tender. "Stay and play." The chair in the corner creaked, its tiny legs scraping against the floor as though something had just climbed into it. Mia's blood ran cold as she turned to look, but the chair was empty. Only the balloon remained, its string swaying gently as if someone had just let it go. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to get out before it was too late. But her feet felt rooted to the spot, her body paralyzed by a fear so intense it felt like it was clawing its way through her veins. She wasn't alone. She knew that now. Whatever was down here with her wasn't human, it wasn't alive. And it wasn't going to let her leave. Mia's hand trembled as she gripped the flashlight tighter, the cold plastic slick against her clammy palm. She could feel her heart beat in her throat, each thud a deafening drumbeat in the suffocating silence. The giggles still echoed in her ears, lingering like the tail end of a nightmare that refused to let go. Her skin prickled with the sensation of being watched. No, not watched, studied. The basement seemed alive now, the walls pulsing faintly with a presence she couldn't see but could feel. It was a heavy, oppressive energy, the kind that made her head swim and her legs feel like lead. Something was here with her, she was certain of it, and it was playing with her, testing her. The flashlight flickered again, the beam wavering as though the batteries were draining far too quickly. With every moment of dimming, her pulse raced, panic clawing its way up her spine. She couldn't shake the thought that the darkness itself was closing in, growing thicker, heavier, almost tactile, like invisible fingers brushing against her skin. The memory of the pale face she'd glimpsed, the painted grin and those glistening black eyes, kept flashing through her mind like a strobe light, disorienting and nauseating. But every time she turned the light in its direction, there was nothing there. "Get it together," she whispered to herself, the sound of her own voice brittle and foreign in the void. The words didn't help. If anything, they only made her feel more alone. She forced herself to focus, to breathe, though the air felt colder with every inhale, as if the basement was pulling the warmth from her body. Her breath came out in faint, misty puffs now, a visible reminder that the temperature was dropping fast. Her logical mind screamed that it didn't make sense. There was no reason for a basement to be this cold, especially not in the middle of summer. But logic had no place here. The giggle returned, louder this time, sharp and shrill, like glass shattering in her ears. It didn't echo like a normal sound. Instead, it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Mia spun around, her flashlight beam cutting frantic arcs through the darkness. It landed on the balloons again, their limp, deflated forms swaying gently as though stirred by an invisible breeze. The motion was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to make her stomach churn. The balloons weren't just moving, they were following her. Her breath hitched as one of the floating balloons, a blue one faded and streaked with dirt, bobbed closer, the string dragging along the floor with a soft, scraping sound. It was almost playful, its movement slow and deliberate, as though it were alive. Mia stumbled back, her foot catching on a piece of debris, and she barely managed to keep herself from falling. Her flashlight beam jittered wildly, landing on a cluster of chairs in the far corner of the room. The chairs were arranged in a loose circle, their chipped and rotting wood barely holding together. Tied to each one was a balloon, their strings knotted tightly around the backs of the chairs like restraints. She stared at them, dread pooling in her stomach as a terrible thought crept into her mind. These weren't just decorations. The chairs were small, impossibly small, child-sized. The image from the stories flooded her mind. A basement full of screaming children, their tiny forms twisted and broken, balloons tied to their lifeless hands. Her throat tightened, bile rising as she fought the urge to vomit. And then she heard it. A faint, rhythmic sound, barely audible at first, like a distant tapping. It grew louder, sharper, and she realized it was footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere deeper in the basement. The sound echoed unevenly as though whoever or whatever was walking had an unnatural gait, their steps dragging slightly as if their feet didn't quite work the way they should. Mia's flashlight flickered violently now, the beam sputtering as if something was actively draining its power. She held her breath, her entire body trembling as the footsteps stopped abruptly. Silence. The kind of silence that wasn't empty but brimming with anticipation, with the promise of something terrible just waiting to strike. And then from behind her came the whisper, "Why are you leaving the party?" Mia whipped around, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, and for a split second, she saw it. The clown. He was crouched in the far corner of the room, his body contorted in a way that made her skin crawl. His face was pale and corpse-like, the paint cracked and flaking, revealing mottled flesh underneath. His eyes were enormous black pits, shiny and wet like polished stones, and his grin stretched far beyond the limits of his face, as if his jaw had been dislocated to accommodate it. His clothes, once bright and colorful, were now tattered and smeared with stains she didn't want to identify. But it wasn't just his appearance that terrified her. It was the way he moved. In a single jerky motion, he sprang to his feet, his limbs bending and snapping unnaturally, as though he were a marionette controlled by invisible strings. His head cocked to the side, the grin never faltering, and he took a single step forward. Mia stumbled back, nearly dropping her flashlight as she tried to put as much distance between herself and the thing in front of her. The clown didn't chase her. He didn't need to. Instead, he bent down slowly, his long, spindly fingers curling around the string of one of the balloons. He held it up, his empty black eyes locked onto hers, and let out a low, guttural laugh. The sound didn't match his face. It was deep, raw, like the rumble of something monstrous lurking beneath the surface. He let go of the balloon, and it floated toward her, impossibly fast, as though propelled by an unseen force. Mia screamed, the sound ripping from her throat as she bolted for the stairs. Her flashlight flickered again, and for a terrifying moment, she was plunged into total darkness. She could hear him behind her now, his laughter echoing in jagged bursts, accompanied by the squeak of balloons and the scrape of his dragging footsteps. She didn't dare look back. The stairs loomed ahead, but they felt impossibly far away. Her legs burned as she ran, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. She could feel him closing in, the cold, wet sensation of his breath brushing against the back of her neck. Her foot hit the bottom step and she lunged upward, clawing at the railing as she scrambled toward the door. The giggle turned into a roar, a deafening, otherworldly sound that made her ears ring and her vision blur. And then, just as she reached the top, something grabbed her ankle. Mia's chest heaved as she clung to the railing, her fingers raw and splintered from gripping the rotted wood too tightly. Her body was on the verge of collapse, every muscle screaming in protest as she tried to pull herself up the stairs. But the instant she felt the cold, clammy grip around her ankle, her panic erupted into blind terror. It wasn't just the sensation of being held, it was the texture. The fingers were thin and rubbery, slick as if coated in some sort of film, and far too long to belong to any human hand. They curled around her leg like hungry tendrils, tightening with unnatural strength, dragging her back down toward the yawning void below. Her scream came out raw, the sound tearing at her throat, but no one would hear her, not above the low, guttural laugh that now reverberated through the basement. The laughter was no longer playful. It had morphed into something guttural and primal, a wet, choking sound, like a dying man gasping for air between fits of hysteria. Mia kicked out wildly, her free leg thrashing as she desperately tried to dislodge the thing's grip. Her shoe connected with something solid, a satisfying crack, but it barely made a difference. If anything, the grip tightened, the claws digging into her skin with enough force to send a searing pain shooting up her leg. Her flashlight had long since been abandoned, its beam extinguished somewhere in the darkness below. Without its light, the basement felt like a bottomless chasm, swallowing every detail into a suffocating blackness that pressed against her from all sides. But she didn't need light to feel the presence of the clown. She could sense him, his towering figure looming just beyond her reach, his breath like an icy mist brushing against her exposed skin. The smell was worse now, the rancid stench of rot mingling with something metallic, like blood left to fester in a damp, forgotten corner. It was a smell that clung to her senses, making her gag even as she struggled to pull herself free. Mia. Her name slithered out of the darkness, drawn out in a sing-song tone that sent a fresh wave of dread coursing through her. It wasn't just a voice, it was a presence. A force that seemed to crawl into her mind, probing her thoughts and feeding on her fear. She felt it everywhere, in the icy sweat dripping down her back, in the prickling sensation at the nape of her neck, and most of all, in the unshakable certainty that this thing wasn't just trying to kill her. It wanted her to suffer. The grip around her ankle suddenly released, and for a brief, fleeting moment, relief surged through her. She scrambled upward, clawing at the stairs like a feral animal, her knees scraping against the splintered wood. But the reprieve was short-lived. Just as she reached the middle of the staircase, something yanked her hoodie from behind, hard enough to choke the breath out of her lungs. She was dragged backward with terrifying force, her nails raking against the steps as she fought to hold on. When she hit the ground, the impact knocked the wind out of her, leaving her gasping and disoriented. her vision blurred, her ears ringing as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. But before she could move, she felt it again, that suffocating cold wrapping around her like a smothering blanket. And then she saw him. He was standing at the base of the stairs, half shrouded in shadow. But there was no mistaking the gleam of his wet black eyes or the grotesque grin that stretched across his face. He was taller than she'd realized, his lanky frame almost inhumanly long, with limbs that seemed to bend in ways they shouldn't. His painted face was cracked and peeling, revealing patches of grey, decayed flesh beneath, and his clown costume hung in tattered strips, swaying with every slow, deliberate movement he made. But it was his hands that terrified her the most. Long, skeletal fingers tipped with jagged nails, stained dark with something that glistened in the faint light, filtering through the cracks in the basement ceiling. He cocked his head to the side, his movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette being manipulated by an inexperienced puppeteer. The string of a balloon dangled from one of his hands, swaying lazily as though taunting her. The balloon itself was a sickly shade of yellow, its surface streaked with grime, and it bobbed in the air as though defying gravity. "Why are you leaving so soon, Mia?" he crooned, his voice dripping with mockery. She couldn't speak, couldn't move. Her limbs felt like lead, weighed down by an invisible force that kept her pinned to the floor. All she could do was stare as he began to approach, each step deliberate and agonizingly slow, the soles of his oversized clown shoes scraping against the concrete. The sound was maddening, a grating, rhythmic squeak that burrowed into her skull and set her teeth on edge. As he drew closer, she noticed something else. There were more balloons now. They were appearing out of the darkness, one by one, floating toward her as though summoned by his presence. Their strings trailed across the floor, weaving together in a grotesque tapestry that seemed to pulse and writhe like a living thing. The air grew colder with each passing second, the temperature plummeting to the point where Mia's breath came out in thick, visible plumes. "You were invited," the clown whispered, crouching down so that his face was mere inches from hers. His breath was icy, reeking of decay and something far worse. "And no one leaves the party early." His grin widened, impossibly so, stretching to the point where his skin began to split. Dark, viscous liquid oozed from the cracks, dripping onto the floor with a sickening splatter. Mia whimpered, the sound barely audible over the pounding of her heart, but it only seemed to amuse him. He leaned closer, his black eyes boring into hers, and for a moment she swore she could see something moving within them, shadows twisting and writhing, faces contorted in agony. And then, with a sudden burst of movement, he grabbed her wrist, his grip ice-cold and unyielding. The balloons surged forward, their strings coiling around her arms and legs like snakes, tightening until she could barely move. She thrashed against them, her cries muffled by the sound of the clown's laughter, which had grown into a deafening cacophony of distorted, overlapping voices. The last thing she saw before the darkness swallowed her was his grin, stretching wider and wider, until it was the only thing left. When Mia's friends finally forced the basement door open, the first thing that hit them was the stench. It wasn't just the musty odor of an abandoned house. This was something far worse, something primal and rotten, a foul cocktail of decayed wood, mildew, and something coppery, metallic, blood. The smell poured out like a living thing, washing over them in waves that made their stomachs churn and their knees wobble. They exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier bravado now completely gone. The dare no longer felt like a game. The house was no longer just an urban legend. "Do you see her?" one of them whispered, his voice trembling, barely audible over the sound of their own breathing. Flashlights sliced through the darkness, their beams jittering as their hands shook. The narrow wooden staircase leading down to the basement yawned before them, a chasm of impenetrable shadow that seemed to go on forever. The faint illumination from their lights barely touched the bottom, as though the darkness itself was swallowing it whole. There was no sign of Mia. The silence that greeted them was suffocating, unnatural. It wasn't the kind of quiet that came from an empty space. It was the silence of something alive, something waiting. The air felt heavier with each passing second, as if the house itself was bearing down on them, watching them, daring them to take another step forward. One of the boys stepped back instinctively, his eyes wide with terror, but the others pressed forward, their fear outweighed by the guilt twisting in their stomachs. "Mia!" one of them called, his voice breaking as it echoed through the house. The sound barely made it past the doorframe, swallowed by the oppressive atmosphere. There was no answer. The house gave nothing back, only the faint groan of its walls settling, or perhaps shifting as if alive. The balloons came first. They floated up from the darkness one by one, their faded colors dulled by age and grime. The strings trailed behind them, writhing and twisting as though moved by an unseen wind. The friends froze, their breath caught in their throats as they watched the balloons rise, drifting toward them like slow, patient predators. There was something almost hypnotic about the way they moved, gliding with an eerie, deliberate grace. That's not normal," one of the girls stammered, her voice a trembling whisper. Her flashlight flickered as her hands shook, the beam darting across the walls and illuminating faint smudges of what looked like handprints. Small handprints. The balloons drifted closer, their strings brushing against the edges of the staircase like ghostly fingers. The group began to back away, their instincts screaming at them to run, but something held them in place. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe it was the faint, distant sound that began to creep into their ears. A soft giggle, high-pitched and childlike, but warped, broken, as though coming from a throat that didn't quite know how to laugh anymore. One of the boys finally snapped. "I'm not doing this. I'm not going down there," he yelled, his voice cracking as he turned and bolted toward the front door. The others barely had time to call after him before he stopped dead in his tracks. He didn't scream. He didn't move. He just stood there, frozen, staring at something just out of view. His flashlight dangled from his hand, the beam aimed uselessly at the ground. His breathing was shallow, almost imperceptible, and his friends rushed to his side, their own fear momentarily forgotten in their concern. "Ryan, what's wrong?" one of them asked, placing a hand on his shoulder. Ryan didn't respond. His eyes were wide, unblinking, fixed on the doorway leading to the front porch. The others followed his gaze, and that's when they saw it. The clown. He stood just outside the doorway, his lanky frame silhouetted by the faint moonlight. His face was pale and corpse-like, his painted grin stretching unnaturally wide across his features. His eyes were pits of black, wet and gleaming, and they seemed to pull the light from the room, swallowing it entirely. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, holding a single balloon in his skeletal hand. One of the girls screamed, breaking the trance, and Ryan finally moved, backward, tripping over his own feet as he scrambled to get away. The clown took a step forward, his oversized shoes scraping against the wooden porch, and the sound sent a wave of panic through the group. They turned and bolted, running back toward the basement door, their earlier hesitation forgotten as their instincts drove them to escape. But the basement was waiting for them. The door slammed shut with a deafening crash, the sound reverberating through the house like a gunshot. The group froze, staring at the door in horror as it began to creak open again, slowly, deliberately, revealing the yawning darkness beyond. And then they saw her. Mia stood at the bottom of the staircase, her face illuminated by the faint glow of their flashlights. For a moment, relief washed over them, but it didn't last. There was something wrong with her. Her head was tilted at an unnatural angle, her eyes wide and blank, unseeing. Her lips were curled into a strange, vacant smile, and her arms hung limply at her sides. "Mia?" one of them called hesitantly, taking a step toward her. She didn't respond. Instead, she began to move, her movements jerky and unnatural, as though she were being pulled forward by invisible strings. The balloons followed her, their strings tangled around her wrists and ankles, dragging her closer to the group. The closer she got, the more they realized that the smile on her face wasn't painted. It was carved. Deep, bloody gashes stretched across her cheeks, the raw flesh glistening in the light. "Mia!" another friend screamed, their voice cracking with desperation. But she didn't stop. Behind her in the darkness, the clown emerged. His grin stretched impossibly wide. His black eyes locked onto the group as he began to laugh. A deep, guttural sound that shook the very air around them. The balloons surged forward, their strings coiling around the friends like vines, dragging them toward the open basement door. They struggled, screamed, but it was no use. The last thing they saw was the clown, his face filling their vision as he leaned in close, whispering, "Welcome to the party." When the police arrived the next morning, the house was empty. There was no sign of Mia or her friends, only a single deflated balloon lying on the porch, its string tied in a perfect bow around the rotting wood. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new terrifying tale. And remember, some dares aren't meant to be taken. Would you go down to the basement, knowing what's waiting for you in the dark?